with a fundamental question, which is, why? Like, why do people hate Jews?
So I want to just take a running leap at that. It assumes that people don't hate everybody, and so I just want to peg that.
Why do people hate Jews especially?
Well, yeah, so that's right. The question is, you know, I mean, why are people so angry, and why do they try to cover up their own insecurities by hating others? And then in that mix, it's true that, you know, each form of hatred has its own distinctive history and contours. The astonishing thing about Jew hatred is it's so persistent, you know, and whether the culture is liberal or conservative or communist or fascist or a monarchy, whether there were Jews who've lived there forever or never had any Jews, it doesn't seem to matter. People just pick it up like it's a virus, like it's an infection. And here I want to just say on behalf of Rabbi Wolpe and myself, you know, we've worked in the Jewish community a long time. So our hatred of Jews is different than anti-Semitism. We've earned it. But, you know, there are these Johnny-come-latelys who rush to the head of the line, and they haven't put in the time. Sorry.
That's like Yitz Greenberg's line, that an anti-Semite is someone who hates Jews more than is absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
Yitz Greenberg is an Orthodox rabbi, by the way, to give the pedigree of that line. But, I mean, it is certainly true what you're saying, that hatred is an intrinsic and resentment is an intrinsic part of being a person. I don't know how to get rid of the feedback. Perhaps you do. Thank you. It is an intrinsic part of being a person. And I wonder how much the fact that Jews were always the identified outsiders in almost every society, that, by the way, at least in my theory, makes America different, because we're not the identified outsiders. That is, there were Russians and Jews, there were Poles and Jews, there were Germans and Jews, there were Muslims and Jews in various countries. But in America, there are lots and lots of different groups. And you should excuse me for putting it this way, but the hatred is spread around. It's not like there's one group that everybody focuses on. And I think that that's part of the reason we've done better here.
So I'd like to think there's both that reason, which is a kind of sociological reason, and then I think it's also that America...
Hold the mic closer to
Sorry. That America was founded as part of an enlightenment, and at its best, that enlightenment ideology that judges individuals rather than groups has a mitigating effect. But I think your original question is still a powerful one, which is, in the midst of that, why is there such virulent hatred of Jews that never went away, but it appears to be coming out again more easily? Like they don't bother to hide anymore, and they manifest in all kinds of ways. And that is astonishing. And part of what's astonishing about it is that Jews have played such a constructive and positive role in this country from its inception. You know, the difference in European anti-Semitism, we were the #1 outsiders. And we were visibly the only ones who weren't part of Christendom. You know, in the Muslim world, we were the #1 presence, and we had significant numbers, as many of you know, throughout the Muslim world until recently. We were the #1 non-participants. But in America, because of the diversity, and we were here from the beginning, you know, George Washington liked us, and Thomas Jefferson not so much. But Hamilton liked us, and he's coming, his stock is rising.
He might have been one of us.
He indeed could have
There are
been.
theories that Hamilton was Jewish.
Very good at the bank.
Everybody, by the way, who does well in public, there's some Jewish genealogist who's searching out their Jewish
claim
roots.
The guy.
Yep.
Yeah, well, and he's doing well in Hollywood too, so it could be.
There you go.
But I think here too, we represent in some ways people's worst fear. And you know, you can't be that bad an outsider if you hate a Jew, right? So the Jew helps you feel less outside. And then we are the kind of naysayers, right? We're always the people who are talking about communal responsibility, about our obligations to, like, people don't want to hear that, you know? And I think we represent, in a sense, humanity's bad conscience. And in that sense, I know it sounds very rabbinic, but I think that Yehuda Halevi was right when he talked about the Jews are like the canary in the coal mine. You know, we're the organ that if another organ is sick, it manifests in us. And I think there's a large degree of truth to that, what brokenness there is in the American economy manifests in people who should be mad at someone else getting mad at Jews.
I mean, you remind me of Maurice Samuel, who was a writer and a translator. He said that when someone asked him, why don't people like Jews? He said, no one likes their alarm clock.
Right.
Which I thought was a great answer.
Yeah.
Great answer. The other part of this, of course, is that because Jews have been in so many different countries and not had a country of their own, whatever social ills existed in the country, you had a choice. You could blame it on yourself, you could blame it on the structure of the country, or you could blame it on those outsiders who are there. And once that meme gets started, it's very hard because if you live in country X and you see the country Y is blaming their problems on the Jews, that has a big appeal to you in country X. So, and also, I don't think that we should neglect the fact, we can't neglect the fact, that this was turbocharged by Christianity. And the reason that that's so is that Judaism and Christianity, remember, started as the same thing. The earliest Christians thought of themselves as Jews. They didn't think of themselves as a different religion. They thought the Jewish Messiah had come, just like was always predicted, and they were Jews who recognized the Messiah. Everybody here knows, I'm guessing, that some of the meanest fights are within families. So the people who didn't accept Jesus were very upsetting to the people who did. And that family fight, because it was a family fight, it was like a civil war. It was like brother against brother, one who did accept, one who didn't. That got enshrined in the New Testament, which became a permanent religious book. So 500 years later, people weren't reading it anymore as a family fight. They were reading it as those evil Jews who did this. And when it says, when Jesus is being crucified, and they say, his blood be on us and on our children, which single line did probably more, has spilled more Jewish blood than any other line in history, that meant forever that there was this added religious heresy component that made it particularly awful.
And if I could add to that, many of the people in this room know from personal experience that Islam had the same developmental history, that the Prophet Muhammad had very positive things to say about Jews in his early period when he thought that Jews would naturally accept his revelation. And when it became clear that the Jewish communities did not, that's when you get the vicious Jews are like apes, Jews should be killed, which exists also in the Quran as it exists in the Gospels. And so you have the same thing. It's baked into the holy literature, and it gets removed from the context of they won't join my club, so I hate them. It becomes this metaphysical thing, and then modernity turbocharged it yet again by turning it into genetics, right? Because don't forget, the solution to medieval anti-Semitism, Muslim or Christian, was not get rid of the Jew. The solution was get rid of the Judaism, right? So that a Jew could at least partially solve the problem by converting. That never worked entirely, but that was at least the program. But with the rise of racial anti-Semitism, the problem is no longer Jews believing in Judaism. The problem is Jews infecting the population. In fact, it's worse if you abandon Judaism, because then you're like an undercover agent. And here I want to say that for me, in the last, can I just, personal confession?
Sure.
You know, I
It's
think
Yom Kippur.
it is, so here we go. Holy Father, I have sinned. I think like many liberal Jews, of which I am one, I think I minimized anti-Semitism in America. I didn't let myself see because it so violated my core that I just wouldn't put the pieces together. And I have to say, in the midst of this confession, it nonetheless is true. My closest childhood friends are non-Jews. To this day, many of my closest friends are non-Jews who are like brothers to me. And that also is part of America and part of American greatness. I don't want to make that invisible. But you know, for 2 years, there was a bully in my school from 6th to 8th grade who beat me up every day for being a dirty Jew, every day. And there was a kid 2 blocks away who, if I saw him, I would have to run because he would really pound me. And I remember a rabbi in Mission Viejo walking to shul one day and a truck driving by and shouting, "Heil Hitler, he was right, you should all die." And I'm sure, like Rabbi Wolpe, you know, we're actively present on Facebook and Twitter and whatever. Not a day goes by that I don't get some kind of anti-Semitic thing. Sometimes it's relatively minor. Sometimes it's, you're not really Jewish, you're a Khazar. Sometimes, that's not a Khazar, by the way, that's a Slavic tribe they're calling me a member of. But I also get "you should all die." I also should get "everybody hates you." I also get "Christ killer." You know, and the thing is that up until this year, I didn't let it sink in. I didn't let myself notice the heaviness of that. And that I think a good deal of American Jewish assimilation is not because of hatred of Judaism. Most American Jews don't know enough to hate Judaism, right? And Judaism is wonderful. When they discover it, wow, this is great. But the world has trained us to internalize anti-Semitism in the same way that I don't think a black person or a brown person or a person of color hasn't internalized racial hatred. I don't think it's possible to be a woman in this country and not have internalized sexism. And I don't think it's possible to be a Jew and not have absorbed that we complain too much, we whine too much, we argue too much. Like, I'm always reticent. When I started to talk to people about anti-Semitism, my Italian Catholic friend, I started with a big apology. I tell him, "I've been thinking about this, I'm really sorry, I don't mean to make a big..." And he said, "Just say it." But I carry this thing in my head that Jews aren't supposed to complain. And I think that's one of the most pernicious pieces of anti-Semitism.
The good thing here is that congregants at Sinai Temple don't have that at all. We shouldn't complain thing.
Don't hold
They're
back.
very healthy.
Don't hold back.
No, actually, what I do want to say in reaction to that is, first of all, I certainly had that growing up. I experienced very little anti-Semitism, and the anti-Semitism I thought was sort of aberrational. And that's partly because I lived in Jewish communities and went to Jewish schools, and you know, I didn't really have an experience, and it was only when I started to move in circles that weren't so Jewish that I saw that. But the other thing I want to bring up, and this is going to be, up to now, I think nobody's had a problem with anything we've said. Now it starts. What I really object to in the Jewish community's reaction to anti-Semitism is not protesting it, which I think is essential, but weaponizing it politically. That is, the way Jews react to anti-Semitism tells you whether they're on the right or on the left. They'll say, but the people who are on the right, they'll only talk about the anti-Semitism on the left. The people who are on the left, they'll only talk about the anti-Semitism on the right. In other words, they're using it to shore up their political position instead of caring more about anti-Semitism wherever it raises its head than they do about where they are politically. And it drives me nuts because I've criticized anti-Semitism right and left, and when I do, I invariably get anger from the other side of the political spectrum. And that shows you, it shows me that Jews care more about their politics than they do about Jew hatred. And that's terrible.
But
That's really bad.
I wonder if that, I agree with what you've said. It's certainly true. And I'll go one step further, the part that didn't get said, that one of the I want to distinguish between the extreme left, the extreme right, and the liberal right and the liberal left. You know what I mean? Right? Like there's people on the right, George Bush, Ronald Reagan, there are fine people on the right who respect democratic process, who respect democratic principles, and they have a conservative ideology and approach to the world, which is vital to American discourse. And then there are people on the center left who respect American democracy, respect pluralism, and they have kind of liberal opinion. And that's also, but there's the loudest voices are often the hard right and the hard left, and both of those do exactly what you've said, and then it kind of leaks towards the middle. And one thing that leaks in with it is a tendency more on the left than the right to blame Israel for anti-Semitism. Yeah. And here I just want to be very clear that that is utterly repugnant and without merit. There are certainly things that Israel does that I don't agree with. There are policies that I don't appreciate and that I think should change. But nobody says the reason I hate Anglo-Saxons is because of the government of Great Britain. Right? Nobody says I hate Mexican Americans because of the policy of Mexico and the government. It's so absurd that all you have to do is reframe it in non-Jewish terms, and it just sounds like an obvious mask for some virulent hatred.
Or ask someone, if in fact anti-Semitism is a product of Israel, was there no anti-Semitism in the 30s and the 40s before there was in Israel? Was the world filled with people who loved Jews? Obviously, that's not the case, and is a mask without question. So turning now to the constructive part of the conversation. What do we do? Like, what do we look for? What do we do? How do we exert our political and other influence? Any advice?
So I have three unrelated but related pieces of advice. The first is, and here I don't want to embarrass him, but I want to celebrate Rabbi Wolpe, right? Because he's become one of the voices for America of a Judaism that is open and urbane and comfortable and literate and robust. And we need to be that in public. We need to not hide our Jewishness. And that pride means we should be putting our voice out in the world, because Judaism has something to say about the social and personal challenges we all face. And we owe the world that. And there are a lot of people for whom that will help shift their opinions when they hear anti-Semites. Second thing I think we all need to do is we need to not let it turn us into circling the wagons against humanity. I'm really intolerant of people who want to say, well, the hatred my group faces is the really bad one. Right? And I don't think that's valid, and I don't think we should ever give in to that. Whatever solutions there may be to anti-Semitism require us to make common cause with all of the people who feel marginalized and excluded by the general culture, because agree or disagree about particular policies, we all do better in a country where all of us can be ourselves. So that, I think, has to be the frame for our conversation. And then the third and somewhat contradictory piece is we have to resist letting the distinctively Jewish piece get erased in a kind of bland humanitarianism. The Holocaust wasn't about man's inhumanity to man. It was about Europe's desire to murder the Jews, which is an example of man's inhumanity to man, but I don't want that particular example to get ignored. So I think we have to fight anti-Semitism in partnership with allies. We have to fight all bigotry in partnership with allies. And then we also have to insist that the particulars of anti-Semitism need to be repudiated and rejected.
Wonderful. So let's take a couple of questions. If you have questions or comments. Yes, please.
So I would like both rabbis to explain.
I'll repeat the questions, by the way. Go ahead.
I would like both rabbis to explain exactly what the conservative and liberal community should do in terms of their donations to these anti-Semitic institutions, namely universities and so on. What do Jews do about that?
Well, universities are one problem. You said, and so on. Different organizations and different institutions are different kinds of problems. And even in universities, there's a huge range we hear generally about the most extreme cases. There are more moderate cases, and then there are universities that are starting at the tipping point. So I think you have to know which university, what's going on there, and how to exert your financial leverage to try to prop up those who are sympathetic and to counter those who aren't. And even at universities that some terrible things go on at, let's take a paradigmatic university as an example, Harvard. A lot of stuff goes on at Harvard that is terrible, Jewishly, but they also have an incredibly strong Hillel. They have a very strong Jewish studies department. They have Ruth Wise, who teaches there, who's one of the leading polemicists for Israel. So it's a complicated thing. You don't want to say nobody should give money, or no, well, they have an endowment that's probably bigger than the United States Treasury, so you don't need to give money to Harvard. But you don't want to say, let's write off Harvard, because these things are complicated. And so I think it depends on the university. I think, as I have done many times, I've written many letters to various university presidents and so on. Some universities have stood up against this. Morton Shapiro at Northwestern is an example, and I cite him as an example not only because he did, but also because he comes to services here when he's in Los Angeles. So I think you have to use, the university that you're associated with. You have to use your knowledge of it and your fundraising power and your dollars to react accordingly. But I don't want to broad brush institutions. I think right now universities are problematic at best, and some of the leading ones, in fact, are truly horrendously awful. So it takes, some knowledge and some work. I mean, I was involved, in fact, in a winning lawsuit where I testified as an expert on anti-Semitism. I gave a deposition against San Francisco State University, where awful stuff was going on, but they won the suit, and they had to change the definition of what anti-Semitism was. So, I mean, all I can say is you've got to work the system as best you can.
And all I will add to that is this is a place where I think Jefferson was right, that the solution to bad speech is more speech, right? And so we are in a paradoxical time. I hope you all read Rabbi Wolpe's article about cancel culture in the New York Times for Yom Kippur. It was a brilliant, wonderful article. And the only thing I would have added as an addendum is the right has been practicing counterculture no less than the left. So the challenge is, when we see someone saying something we don't like, we also try to get them removed or silenced. And we can't then criticize others for doing what we're doing just because they do it better than us sometimes. So
Can I give you an example that might be controversial? And some of you are not going to like this because some of you said this to me. So I'm part of a group called Jewish Liberal Values, which is anti-cancel culture, whatever, suppressing speech. Many people that you know are part of this. And at one of the meetings, brought up the fact that remember these students, the rabbinical students who signed an anti-Israel letter? It was a clearly anti-Israel letter. Rabbi Artson wrote an absolutely magnificent editorial about it, which again, if you haven't read, you should. Our own Rabbi Eric Sherman wrote a beautiful editorial about it. Several people said to me they shouldn't be able to graduate. And I thought, that's actually a mistake. That's doing exactly what we protest against. I wouldn't hire them. That's okay. I would tell someone else, do you really want to hire somebody who unless obviously they change their views, who makes what I think of as anti-Israel statements. But we brought them into rabbinical school and said, if you pass these exams, you get to be a rabbi. You can't turn around and say, because you have views that I despise, I'm now going to make sure that you don't get to be a rabbi. That's cancel culture that hits us, and we don't like it. But if you're really going to say that people shouldn't be canceled for unpopular views, then we can't cancel people for unpopular views either. Even though, as I said, you can say, I would never hire this person, and I would tell other people that I don't think that this is an appropriate representative of the community. But remember that unless your view sometimes bothers you, you don't really hold it. Because a view that you feel about the conduct of other people, sooner or later it's going to come back to bite you. Otherwise, you're just, what you want to do basically is have everybody else agree with you.
The only other thing I'll add then is that universities are going through a very difficult period because free speech is under assault. And it's under assault across the board, right? So what we need is a reassertion of classical liberalism, of the notion
That's why they called it Jewish liberal values. And I said, I don't know, I wish you'd picked a different title because people are going to think it's like, but they meant classical.
But I understand the
classical
reason.
Liberal.
And the other thing I will just say to us is, however frustrating it is, and look, I have friends who are professors of all kinds of fields, and they all have reports of being shot down at faculty meetings on topics that deviate from someone else's politically authorized view, not having anything to do with Jews or Israel even. But I also want to say, there are robust Jewish voices on every campus. So, you know, Rabbi Wolpe mentioned Harvard, which I'm somewhat fond of.
That's his alma mater.
It is. They slipped at least once. But the president of Harvard is a participating member of a conservative congregation in Boston. It's not exactly like the anti-Semites can count Harvard on their side, right? But universities are places where people say all kinds of outrageous things, and that's just what universities are. And I also want to agree with what Rabbi Wolpe said. I did write a strong letter against this letter by the students. I will point out I'm proud of the fact that only 2 Ziegler students signed that letter. But I know the 2 who did. And while they had very strong feelings, and I don't think we're thinking politically, I know that they don't hate Israel. They just weren't like, we're going to do a program this year to train rabbinical students for how you engage in constructive political leadership. Because I don't think many of them have thought about that. But you're right, I also got calls from people who, and my response when people would say, you need to kick them out of the school, is I'd say, how's that cancel culture working for you these days?
Other comments? Yes, please.
I just like to say, anti-Semitism is a bit necessary. The Jewish people survive because we have outside enemies. And anti-Semitism help us to stay together. In countries that are overt anti-Semitism, there is less and less intermarriage. Jewish community survives and thrives. In America, where you have no anti-Semitism, you have more than 70% intermarriage. There is less and less Jewish life. There is people do not teach their children Jewish value and Jewish education.
Okay, so let me address that. Also, you should really, especially if you're speaking.
I apologize.
Right.
So
I would say yes and no, in the sense that it is certainly true that many communities that were persecuted kept together, but many communities that were persecuted disappeared too. And we shouldn't think that persecution necessarily is good for Jews. There have been Jewish communities throughout history, and a lot of other kinds of communities, that disappeared under persecution because they couldn't take it anymore. Look, Spanish Jewry, for example, like 50 to 60% of them converted rather than die or be kicked out, because under persecution they just folded. Ashkenazi Jewry didn't. So you're right that acceptance leads people to want to be part of the society, but I don't think anti-Semitism is a solution either. We have to figure out a better solution than either one.
Well, and let me just say, let me tweak that a little, because I think the statistics actually don't hold up what you're saying. I mean, the challenge in America is how do we get Jews to want to be Jewish? But that's a problem with modernity. In the pre-modern world, 1/10 of the Roman Empire was Jewish. 1/10. Right? So that means that somewhere between ancient Rome and the medieval period, a whole lot of Jews said, I'm out of here. Right? I think many Jews respond to that kind of anti-Semitic pressure by leaving. But I have a bigger problem with that. I grew up not especially engaged in Jewish culture or religion, and in college I fell in love with God and Torah. And I have to believe that that's got to be where we put our energy. That if we can show people the wonder of Jewish wisdom and Jewish life, if we can show them how beautiful a community we have, if we can show them what an incredible place Israel is, that's our biggest shot. So it may be for a separate talk, but I don't think the response to intermarriage or Jews disaffiliating, which by the way are two separate issues, I don't think the response to that would be, well, we just need to make them suffer more because that will force them in. I think our response has to be, have we been creative enough in finding ways to present a Judaism worthy of engagement? And that's where, rabbinical students like Kevin Lefkowitz,
I was going to say, Kevin Lefkowitz is about to take the reins.
Correct, and I'm counting on him and his classmates to think of things that I haven't thought of, because they had wonderful teachers and great training, but they're part of a different generation. So, I, like Moses, won't enter that new land, but I'm training someone who will.
Having said that, I think that there is no denying, though, that the embrace of Jews in liberal societies is a tremendous challenge. Look, Alexandria, to support your point, the Jews of Alexandria were accepted and they disappeared. So that it can work both ways. But since we don't want to encourage people to hate us, we better work the side of us that encourages Jewish life to flourish. Any final statements on anti-Semitism in the future?
So the one thing I want to say, I gave a talk about return on last night, and I tweaked an old Zionist line, right? That we are meant to be Am Chofshi B'libenu Uve'artzenu. That we're meant to be a free people in our hearts and in our land. And I really believe that twin return is the best antidote to fighting anti-Semitism. That if we liberate ourselves to be free Jews in public and in private, and we liberate ourselves to stand with Israel in pride, that's the best we can do to show ourselves and the world that we're not going away.
And I'll add one other thing that we haven't touched on, just because I think it's important to keep in mind. Thank you. It's important to keep in mind, which is a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of it comes from ignorance, from people who've actually never thought about it one way or the other and are just repeating things that other people have said to them. And part of our, maybe it shouldn't have to be our task, but it is part of our task, is to educate people about what Jews and Judaism is, because you know that there are, all over this country, there are people who've literally never met a Jew. They've never met a Jew. And if they met you, they would, be running their hands through your hair to search for your horns. Seriously. I mean, the level of ignorance can be that great. So sometimes education actually works. And the more that there are Jewish voices saying Jewish things in the public, I think that is a good thing. And with that, our rabbinic intern, Kevin Lefkowitz.